The question is one democracy is always asking of itself. Of the many things we can do to democracy, says a man I know, the worst is the indignity of taking it for granted. Some people think, oh, the constant self-examination loosens our unity as a people. But I prefer the counsel of Sidney Hook, who said that in contrast to totalitarianism, democracy can face and live with the truth about itself. In the quiet precincts of scholarship, Sheldon Wolin wrestles with the meaning of democracy, the nature of power, and the role of the state. But his insights as a political philosopher are also drawn from the noisy streets where theory confronts the realities of American life. Wolin was teaching at the University of California at Berkeley in the 1960s, where he witnessed and wrote about the student movement. Later, at Princeton, he founded and edited a journal called Democracy. Shortly before he left for a year's teaching in Japan, I caught up with Sheldon Wolin at the Clark Library at the University of California in Los Angeles. Let's start with the past for a moment. You were at Berkeley doing the demonstrations, the radical politics of the 60s. What do we have to learn today, good or bad, from the 60s?
I think a lot. I think it's easy to both romanticize the 60s as well as to denigrate it. If I were to, I think the one thing that I come away with really is, it seems to me, the whole question of a participatory understanding of politics, meaning by that the wide range of groups and peoples who are now involved in politics in America that never would have really reached that level of political consciousness, that's very much the legacy of the 60s. I think
power to the people, that sort of slogan.
Right, yeah. And the decentralization of power, and the notion of power is shared, and the notion of political activity involving collaborative activity.
Do you think that the expectations raised by the 60s, the expectations of democratic participation, power to the people, have been largely disappointed, frustrated?
I think to some degree they have been. And I think one clear way in which they have been, or that has caused them the frustration, I think has to do with what, again, doesn't receive the kind of press it needs to, and that is the question of the growth, the continuous, consistent growth of centralized power in our society. People think of Ronald Reagan as an opponent of state power and as someone who wanted to get government off our backs and the rest of the campaign rhetoric. But actually, one of the legacies of the Reagan era is a stronger state, a state that doesn't do as much in terms of regulation of the economy as the states growing out of the New Deal, Fair Deal kind of tradition, but a state which, in terms of defense, in terms of the protection of American interests abroad, in areas such as the advancement of technology or the law and order state, all of those involve extensions of national power.
Is this for better or worse?
I think it's for worse. I think it's for worse because it's been accompanied, as we know, by an incredible amount of apathy on the part of the American electorate in terms of the simple fact of voting. It is a less alert, a less involved electorate at the national level.
So the national government becomes stronger, but the participation, knowledge, and involvement of the people diminishes.
Absolutely. And at the same time, it's becoming much more of a surveillance and control state in terms of the way that it intervenes in, knows about, pries into individual lives.
Growing up. What you just said, this will strike you as a very simplistic question, but I need to ask it. Do we have a democracy?
It isn't a simplistic question, and the answer is, I think we don't. I don't think the idea of democracy and the idea of a strong state, centralized, inherently bureaucratic and administrative in its structure and orientation, that those are compatible notions. I think democracy does imply involvement, shared power, dispersed power, and above all, a significant equality. And I think state power means the opposite of those things. And similarly, I think the democracy clearly is at odds with corporate structures and the power of corporate structures.
Hierarchy.
Exactly. And also power that's unaccountable, power that basically is unresponsive and is concerned with other things, bottom lines, profit margins and the rest.
Don't we, in fact, have a rather thinly concealed power structure of large public institutions and private corporations?
I think the most important developments in the last 25 years or so has been the closer integration and intertwining of those two dominant structures of power, economic and political power. I think one of the interesting aspects of that, is this push towards so-called privatization of public functions now, where private corporations are now encouraged to take over what used to be regarded as public functions, whether it be education, medical care, hospital care, or again, a whole range.
Prisons. I mean, you get the government contracting with corporations to build and run prisons.
Sure. Or
what does all that say to you?
It says to me not what I think people are saying. It says most people think that means what you're seeing is a decentralization of government power, and that you're dismantling the state. And I think that's absolutely wrong. I think what it means is an extension of power, which now is not coming from the state, but is coming from a combination of public and private power concerted.
Is this what you meant when you wrote that every one of this country's primary institutions is anti-democratic in spirit, design, and operation?
It is.
That's a strong statement. Every one of the country's primary institutions, meaning?
Meaning educational institutions, large-scale educational institutions, meaning institutions of government, bureaucratic institutions, major institutions of media and communication, major institutions of a recognizably economic kind as well, and I think large cultural institutions too. Again, something like the media.
Is anti-democratic, meaning? Meaning
that two things. One, hierarchical. They're all hierarchical structures, and hierarchy means inequality. Means inequality of power. Secondly, I think they're fundamentally elitist in character, which is to say that each of them involves a definition of who should lead or control that institution based upon criteria which can only be met by a relatively few. So it becomes a way of excluding.
And that means anti-democratic. You do not consult the people. You do not involve the people. You do not. And yet, as you talk, I keep hearing the criticisms of the last 10 or 15 years. I'm sure you remember them. There's been an excess of democracy, critics said. We have too much democracy, too much participation, growing in part out of the 1960s. Now, isn't there a contradiction there?
No, I think that the notion of there being too much democracy is basically hogwash.
What are the questions you think we must ask as we move toward that rapidly approaching year 2000?
The central question to me is the question of what I would call collective identity. That is, what do we think we want to stand for as a people? And that's what I think the democracy, the preoccupation with the democratic culture for me is all about. That what I think we want to stand for is not expansion of American power, not the endless economic and technological innovation that I think we're committed to, whether we want to be or not.
We the people in order to.
In order to, yes, and justice as part of it, and so is defense, of course. But it's a first stab at a collective, at an understanding of ourselves and how we want to present ourselves to the world.
Is it romantic to think that each of us, high and low, black and white, male and female, has an opportunity to contribute to the answer to that question?
Oh, I think we do, because I think fundamentally democracy in a democratic culture comes down not to big, highfalutin institutions or policies. It comes down ultimately to how we treat each other in our ordinary range of relationships and conversations.